All right, so today we're diving into some seriously fascinating territory, given your background in philosophy. We're tackling colonialism, but from a philosophical angle.
Oh, yeah, colonialism. It's not just dates and names and conquest, right? There's a whole world of ethical questions and power dynamics and ideas about what it even means to govern.
And we've got a fantastic resource to guide us, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on colonialism. Talk about a deep dive.
Oh, yeah, that entry is a gold mine. It lays out all the key arguments, the historical justifications, the critiques, all the ways philosophers have wrestled with this really complex phenomenon.
Yeah, our mission today is to really unpack that.
Yeah.
How did thinkers try to make sense of colonialism? What were the arguments for and against it? And how have those ideas evolved over time?
It's a journey through the evolution of thought, really, and one with huge implications for how we understand the world today, especially for a philosopher like yourself.
So let's get down to brass tacks. The entry starts off with a definition. Colonialism, at its core, is about domination. One group of people subjugating another.
Right. And that's happened throughout history, of course. But the thing is, the 16th century really changed the game. Those advancements in navigation, suddenly, large-scale, long-term political control across oceans became
It's
possible.
like the scale of colonialism exploded, and that forced people to think differently about it.
Right, exactly. Suddenly, you had Europeans encountering completely different societies, imposing their will on a massive scale. It raised all these new questions about what justified that kind of power, what made it legitimate, if anything. And speaking of legitimacy, we often throw around colonialism and imperialism as if they're the same thing.
Right, yeah, they kind of get lumped together. So how does the entry differentiate those two?
Well, it suggests that colonialism often involved settlement. Think about the European populations established in North America or Australia.
Like transplanting themselves onto another land.
Exactly. While imperialism, the entry argues, was more about control without necessarily significant settlement. Think of the European powers carving up Africa in the 19th century.
Okay, so settlement versus just, administration and control.
Yeah, though it's worth noting, those lines weren't always so clear-cut in practice, and even in the academic literature, there's some inconsistency.
The messy realities of history. But the etymology, the roots of the words themselves, might shed some light. Right.
Absolutely. Colony comes from the Latin colonus, meaning farmer. So it's inherently tied to this idea of population transfer, people putting down roots, but with allegiance still to the mother country.
And then you have imperialism, from imperium, which means to command.
Exactly. Power, control, domination, those are the central ideas there. And even the concept of imperialism itself has evolved over time.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, the British were talking about their empire centuries ago, but their focus was mostly on military might, right?
Right. But then you have someone like Lenin in the 20th century, and he's analyzing imperialism as a stage of capitalism. It's all about economic expansion, driven by the need for new markets and resources.
So for our deep dive, how should we think about these two terms?
I think a good working definition would be this. Colonialism, that big European project of political domination from the 16th century onward, and imperialism as the broader phenomenon of economic, military, and political control, not necessarily with permanent settlement.
Okay, so with those definitions in mind, let's jump into the philosophical debates, especially around that pivotal moment, the Spanish conquest of the Americas.
Yeah, talk about a philosophical earthquake. It forced people to grapple with some really fundamental ethical questions. And for you as a philosopher, it's fascinating to see how this played out.
It's like this clash between different ways of thinking about right and wrong. You had the Spanish justifying their conquests in religious terms, right?
Right. Conquest for conversion, the idea of bringing Christianity to the indigenous populations. And it wasn't a totally new idea either. They drew on the Crusades, that historical precedent, and this idea of the Patrine Mandate. Basically, the Pope had authority in worldly matters too.
So they used religion to legitimize their actions, but not everyone bought it, right?
Definitely not. Humanist scholars, influenced by Thomas' natural law, started pushing back. They said, wait a minute, is this really just? And those are the kinds of questions philosophers love to tackle.
You have someone like Pope Innocent V himself arguing that simply being a non-Christian wasn't grounds for war or taking people's land.
Right, he said force could only be used legitimately in response to violations of natural law. And that's a key idea. Principles discoverable through reason, binding on everyone, regardless of their faith.
So how did the colonizers respond to that?
Well, they tried to argue that the indigenous peoples, through their customs, their way of life, weren't capable of understanding natural law. They pointed to things like how they dressed, their attitudes towards labor, even made accusations of cannibalism.
They basically said, they're different, therefore they don't have the same rights.
Exactly. And they used that as justification for subjugation, even enslavement. We're bringing them civilization and Christianity, doing them a favor.
But thankfully, not everyone in Europe was on board with this.
No, not at all. Some Spanish missionaries witnessed the brutality firsthand and were horrified, especially the Dominican order. They were like, hold on, this isn't what we signed up for.
It's a classic ethical dilemma, the gap between ideals and reality. And this is where figures like Bartolomé de las Casas and Franciscus de Victoria enter the picture.
Yeah, Las Casas was incredible. He witnessed the atrocities, spoke out against them, and advocated for the rights of indigenous people. And for a philosopher, Victoria's work is particularly fascinating.
Because he applied Thomism, that
Mhm.
natural law philosophy, directly to the colonial situation, right?
Exactly. He said, look, all human beings have rationality. It's what makes us human. Therefore, we all have inherent natural rights.
It's a radical idea for the time and a foundation for modern human rights theory.
And it led him to conclude that the Pope had no authority to just give away the Americas to Spain. He also said neither the Pope nor the Spanish crown could punish non-Christians for things that weren't violations of universal natural law, like their religious practices, their political systems, even things like, as the entry puts it, fornication.
That's a major blow to the colonizers' justification for conquest. But Victoria wasn't totally against the use of force, right?
No, he wasn't a pacifist. But he made a very important distinction. He said, okay, there's natural law, which applies to individuals, and then there's the law of nations, which governs relations between peoples.
And that law of nations, it's also based on reason, right?
Yeah, he believed it was derivable from reason and held universal force because, well, most nations agreed to it, and it was for the common good. But he said this law was about things like preventing harm to the global community.
So if someone was blocking peaceful trade or travel, that could justify intervention.
Right. It's a nuanced argument, and one that still potentially opens the door for colonialism. But it was a big step away from justifying conquest based on religious differences or just because someone's culture is different.
It's like he's trying to set some ground rules, some limits on when force is acceptable.
Exactly, and that's a constant struggle in philosophy, trying to define those limits, to find a balance between individual rights and collective needs.
All right, so let's fast forward a couple of centuries to the Enlightenment. This is the age of reason, individual liberty, self-government. You'd think colonialism wouldn't stand a chance.
You'd think so, right? And the entry does mention that key Enlightenment figures like Kant, Smith, and Diderot criticized the brutality of colonialism and that paternalistic idea of a civilizing mission.
Yeah, those ideas clash with the whole Enlightenment ethos of self-determination.
They do, but here's the thing. Those universal ideals weren't enough to dismantle the economic and political systems that fueled colonialism. It's one thing to say everyone has rights, but it's another to actually change the power structures on the ground.
Power is sticky, man. And this is where that idea of developmental history, those stages of civilization theories, come into play.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. The idea that societies progress through stages from hunting and gathering to pastoralism to agriculture and finally to commerce and civilization, it became this very common way of understanding history.
And it wasn't just a liberal idea either, right?
Nope. You see it in Burke, Marx, Mill, all sorts of thinkers. But it's especially relevant here because it created a hierarchy.
With Europe at the top, naturally.
Of course. And that gave them a convenient justification for intervention. They could say, look, these other societies are at an earlier stage. They need our guidance. We're just helping them progress.
It's like the ultimate paternalism. We know what's best for you. And that brings us to John Stuart Mill, a champion of liberty in many ways, but also someone who articulated a view that's often called liberal imperialism.
Ugh, Mill. A fascinating and frustrating figure. On the one hand, he's all about individual rights, freedom of speech. But on the other, he argues that some societies just aren't ready for self-government.
He divides them into categories, right?
Yeah. Savages, who he saw as having too much freedom, no restraint. Barbarians, who were stuck in systems of obedience that stifled rationality. And then commercial society, the pinnacle where self-government could flourish.
So how does imperialism fit into this?
Well, for Mill, it's this temporary, necessary evil. It's about exporting civilization, helping those less developed societies progress to the point where they can govern themselves.
Even if it requires what he called despotic government in the meantime. It's a very paternalistic view.
Absolutely. And from a modern perspective, it's deeply problematic. I mean, who gets to decide when a society is ready? Who holds the colonizers accountable? These are fundamental ethical questions that Mill doesn't really address.
And the entry connects this to Edmund Burke's criticisms of the East India Company, all those abuses of power, the lack of accountability. But it also mentions that Burke's views on imperialism are more complex than they might appear at first glance.
Yeah, it's not a simple black and white picture. Even those who critique the excesses of colonialism often still held on to those underlying assumptions about European superiority. And then you have someone like Tocqueville, who supported French colonialism in Algeria, but for completely different reasons.
Tocqueville, the guy who wrote Democracy in America, he was pro-colonialism.
Well, he saw it as a matter of French national interest. It would boost their global standing, give their population more space, and foster patriotism. But he was also very aware of the brutality involved.
So it wasn't about a civilizing mission for him,
Mm-mm.
just cold, hard, realpolitik.
Pretty much. He even shifted away from this idea of racial amalgamation, of French and Algerians mixing. His focus was on the stability of French settlers, which shows the real power dynamics at play.
It's a reminder that even thinkers we consider progressive can hold views that are, well, shocking from a modern perspective. Okay, so let's switch gears and look at colonialism through a Marxist lens.
All right, so Marx and his followers, their focus is on the economic systems that drive colonialism. It's not about religion or civilizing missions for them. It's about material interests, about exploitation.
The entry points out that Marxist theories of colonialism aren't as dominant today, but they had a huge impact on post-colonial thought and anti-colonial movements.
Oh, absolutely. They provided a powerful critique of the economic underpinnings of colonialism, and those ideas continue to resonate. Marx himself argued that capitalism has this inherent drive to expand. It needs new markets, new resources to keep going.
So colonialism is like a natural outgrowth of that system.
Exactly. It's a way to access raw materials, new customers, places to invest. And Marx had some interesting and sometimes contradictory things to say about British colonialism in India.
He wrote about it in the New York Daily Tribune, right?
Yeah, he saw pre-colonial India as this kind of stagnant, feudal society. And while he condemned the suffering caused by British rule, he also argued that it was unintentionally modernizing India, bringing in infrastructure, setting the stage for capitalist development.
It's like he saw it as a necessary, albeit brutal, step in a larger historical process.
Yeah, he had this idea that capitalism, even in its colonial form, was breaking down old structures, creating the conditions for eventual revolution. He also criticized what he called Oriental despotism, this system of centralized control and communal land ownership. He saw them as obstacles to economic progress.
So he was critical of both the pre-colonial systems and the colonial ones. But Lenin took a much harder line on imperialism, right?
Oh, absolutely. For Lenin, imperialism was the highest and final stage of capitalism. It was a desperate attempt by capitalist countries to stave off their own internal crises by exporting their problems, exploiting other parts of the world.
And he saw it as driven by the rise of monopolies, these giant corporations vying for control over global resources and markets.
Exactly. It's all about economic competition for Lenin. And the entry also mentions other Marxist theorists like Luxemburg, Kautsky, and Bukharin, who each offered their own insights. But Lenin's work had the biggest impact, especially on anti-colonial movements.
So as we move into the 20th century, the era of formal colonial empires starts to crumble, and we see the emergence of theories of decolonization and this whole field of post-colonial thought.
And Frantz Fanon is a towering figure in that landscape. He offered profound insights into the psychological and political dimensions of liberation.
His work is still so relevant today. Black Skin, White Masks, Wretched of the Earth, these are essential reads for anyone trying to understand the legacies of colonialism.
Absolutely. Black Skin, White Masks is all about internalized racism, the fragmented identities that colonialism imposes on the colonized, the psychological wounds, the sense of alienation.
It's a powerful exploration of the subjective experience of colonialism.
And then Wretched of the Earth tackles the process of liberation, the violence involved, the psychological and political struggles of forging a new identity, a new nation. He also critiques what he calls the comprador bourgeoisie, those local elites who collaborate with colonial powers and perpetuate those systems of exploitation.
It's a reminder that decolonization isn't just about kicking out the colonizers. It's about dismantling those internal structures of power, too. And the entry places Fanon within a broader tradition of Black radical thought.
Yeah, figures like Eric Williams and C.L.R. James, who analyzed the intertwined histories of race and capitalism, they showed how colonialism wasn't just about political control, it was about economic exploitation, and that exploitation was deeply racialized.
It's about understanding how these systems of oppression reinforce each other. And speaking of challenging oppressive systems, we can't forget about Mahatma Gandhi.
Oh, absolutely. His philosophy of satyagraha, nonviolent resistance, was incredibly influential. And his book, Hind Swaraj, offers a powerful critique not just of British colonialism, but of Western civilization itself.
He questioned the whole materialist, individualistic ethos of the West. He argued that its so-called progress was actually harmful.
And that's a radical perspective. It's not just about reforming the system, it's about questioning the fundamental values that underpin it. And then you have Edward Said and his groundbreaking work, Orientalism.
That book changed the way we think about representation, about how knowledge itself can be a tool of power.
It did. Say showed how the West constructed this idea of the Orient as exotic, inferior, unchanging. And that construction wasn't just some neutral observation.
It served to justify European domination. It created this other that could be controlled and exploited.
Exactly. And that's what makes SETI's work so crucial. It reveals how knowledge and power are intertwined, how the way we know something can be used to reinforce hierarchies and justify oppression.
And then Gayatri Spivak comes along and further complicates these ideas with her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?
Ah, Spivak. She really challenges us to think critically about representation. She argues that the voices of marginalized groups, the subaltern, are often filtered through the lens of the dominant group.
So even when they're speaking, they're not truly being heard on their own terms.
Exactly. And that raises really important questions about agency, about who gets to speak for whom, about how power dynamics shape the very possibility of representation.
It's a critique that sparked a lot of debate within post-colonial studies. Some scholars, like Ajaz Ahmad, argue that Spivak's focus on discourse downplays the importance of material realities and historical progress.
Right. And then you have scholars like Chibber and Chakrabarty who are debating the universality or Eurocentricity of concepts like capitalism and rationality. It shows that post-colonial theory is this constantly evolving, self-critical field.
And the entry also points out that the term post-colonial itself has been challenged. Scholars like McClintock and even Gandhi himself have raised concerns about its implications.
Yeah, it can suggest this kind of clean break from colonialism, which isn't always the reality. And it can also flatten the very different experiences of colonialism around the world.
Like saying post-colonial lumps together the Algerian experience with the Indian experience, which were vastly different.
Exactly. And finally, the entry brings us to the specific context of settler colonial states. This is where indigenous scholars have offered some of the most powerful critiques of post-colonial theory.
They argue that it often fails to address the ongoing realities of settler domination, the fact that colonization isn't just a past event for them, it's a present reality.
Absolutely. And the focus shifts here to concepts like recognition, reconciliation, and importantly, resurgence.
And those ideas are often contested, right?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of debate around the ethics of reconciliation. Many indigenous scholars argue that it often focuses on healing and forgiveness without addressing the fundamental injustices of land dispossession and the continuation of colonial power structures.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Yeah, exactly. And you see this tension in debates about indigenous participation in colonial institutions. Some, like Dale Turner, advocate for engaging with those systems, trying to change them from within. He calls them word warriors.
Working within the system to dismantle it. But others, like Tuck and Yang, are much more critical of reconciliation efforts.
Right. They argue that these efforts can become a move to innocence for settlers, allowing them to avoid confronting the ongoing nature of settler colonialism. They insist that decolonization is not a metaphor.
It's not just about symbolic gestures or feel-good narratives. It's about real structural change.
Exactly. And for many indigenous scholars, that change requires a return to their own legal and political traditions, their own ways of being. It's about resurgence.
Reclaiming what was lost, rebuilding their own sovereign systems.
Yeah, and the entry mentions key thinkers like Leanne Simpson, who focuses on grounded normativity and indigenous resistance through blockades, and Glenn Coulthard, who critiques the idea of seeking recognition from the colonizers.
Coulthard draws on Fanon's work.
Yeah,
Right?
he does. He argues that recognition within a colonial system just reinforces that system's power. True decolonization requires indigenous self-determination, a revitalization of their own values and traditions.
It's about breaking free from those imposed frameworks and reclaiming their own agency. And the entry also touches on the role of international institutions like the UNDRP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Yeah, that's a complex one. Some scholars, like Cheryl Lightfoot, see it as a potential tool for collective action, while others, like Hayden King, critique its limitations within the existing global order.
It's still operating within a system that's fundamentally based on nation-states, which doesn't always align with indigenous conceptions of sovereignty.
Right. And Rana Kukkonen offers an interesting alternative with her relational theory of self-determination. She emphasizes interconnectedness and indigenous ontologies, those ways of understanding the world, as a way to address issues like violence against indigenous women.
So it's not just about rights within a Western legal framework. It's about fundamentally different ways of thinking about relationships and responsibility.
Exactly. And this brings us to what some scholars are calling a new humanism emerging from indigenous thought.
A new humanism.
Yeah, it's about valuing diverse perspectives, understanding that truth can be found in many places, not just in Western thought. It's a universalism that embraces particularities, that recognizes the coexistence of different ways of knowing and being.
It's a challenge to those universalizing narratives that often erase difference.
It is. And it emphasizes the importance of indigenous knowledge systems, especially their relationships with the natural world. John Barrows talks about the 7 generations principle, the idea of making decisions with future generations in mind.
That's a powerful concept. It's about thinking long-term, about sustainability, about responsibility to something larger than ourselves.
And that's what's so exciting about this new humanism. It offers a different way of thinking about the world, a way that centers indigenous knowledge and values.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that the philosophical dimensions of colonialism are incredibly rich and complex.
We've got those tensions between justifying and critiquing domination, between universal ideals and particular contexts, between linear and cyclical views of history.
Between recognition and resurgence, between different ways of understanding what it even means to be human.
And these aren't just abstract debates. These ideas have real-world implications. They shape how we understand history, power, and justice. The legacies of colonialism are all around us, and these philosophical frameworks help us make sense of them.
And that brings us to a final thought, especially for you as a philosopher. How did these frameworks illuminate those contemporary issues we're grappling with? Global inequality, sovereignty, the ongoing legacies of colonialism. What's the responsibility of philosophy in addressing these challenges?
Those are the big questions, and I think engaging with these diverse philosophical perspectives is crucial to finding answers, to imagining a more just and equitable future.
So, I'll leave you with that challenge. Keep thinking, keep questioning, keep diving deep. Thanks for joining us.